The courtroom goes quiet when one piece of evidence hits the table. Suddenly, everything the family said they stood for starts to fall apart. One wife is about to expose a truth so devastating it could destroy not just a marriage, but an entire legacy built over decades. The courthouse steps are crowded long before the doors even open. The early morning air carrying a restless tension that feels heavier than it should, like something bigger than a legal dispute is about to unfold. And inside, beneath the harsh white lights and the low hum of whispered conversations, a family that once built its identity on unity now sits scattered, divided not just by distance, but by something far deeper, something that has been quietly growing for years, and as the camera of our imagination moves through the room, it lands first on Kody, sitting rigidly at the defense table. His posture straight, almost defiant, but his fingers tapping ever so slightly against the wood betray a nervous energy he can't fully hide. His eyes scanning the room not with confidence but with calculation, like he's trying to anticipate where the next threat might come from, and beside him, Robyn sits closer than necessary, her hands clasped tightly together, her face already flushed with emotion as if she's been holding back tears long before the hearing even began, her gaze fixed downward, avoiding the eyes of anyone across the room, especially Christine, who sits on the opposite side with a stillness that feels almost unnatural. Her expression calm but not soft, composed but not forgiving. The kind of calm that comes only after a long internal battle has already been fought and won, and next to her, Janelle leans slightly back in her chair, arms crossed, her face thoughtful, observant, not outwardly emotional, but deeply present, as if she's been quietly piecing together a puzzle for years and is now finally ready to see the full picture, while Mary sits a little apart from everyone, not physically distant, but emotionally detached, her eyes moving between each person in the room with a quiet sadness, like someone who has already mourned the loss of something long before anyone else admitted it was gone. And as the judge enters and the courtroom rises, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoes sharply, cutting through the tension. And when everyone sits again, the silence that follows is almost suffocating, because this isn't just another case. This is the unraveling of a family that once convinced the world, and maybe even themselves, that they had found a way to make something unconventional work. And as the proceedings begin, the narration pulls us backward, slipping into memories that feel warmer at first glance but carry subtle fractures beneath the surface, flashes of shared laughter around a dinner table, voices overlapping, children running through open spaces, Kody at the center of it all, charismatic, confident, promising balance, fairness, love that would be equally divided and endlessly abundant, and for a while it seemed believable, even real. But then the tone shifts slightly, almost imperceptibly, as small moments begin to stand out, moments that once seemed insignificant but now feel loaded with. Meaning, a conversation where Christine's concerns are brushed aside with a quick reassurance that never truly addresses the issue. A decision about finances made without full transparency, a subtle shift in attention that favors one household over the others, and at first, no one calls it out directly, because doing so would mean acknowledging that something fundamental isn't working, and so instead, it lingers beneath the surface, growing quietly, feeding on silence and hesitation, until it becomes impossible to ignore, and Christine's voice begins to emerge more clearly in these memories, not loud or aggressive, but persistent, questioning, searching for clarity, for fairness, for something that feels like the partnership she was promised, but each time she pushes, she's met with explanations that feel incomplete, reassurances that feel rehearsed, and slowly her patience begins to wear thin. While Janelle's journey looks different on the surface but leads to a similar place, her trust in the system, in Kody's management, in the idea that everything is being handled fairly, begins to crack as she notices patterns that don't quite add up, numbers that feel off, decisions that seem to benefit some more than others, and she doesn't react immediately. She observes, She processes. She tries to make sense of it before jumping to conclusions, but the more she looks, the harder it becomes to ignore the inconsistencies. And Miri's story runs parallel, but quieter. Her emotional distance growing over time, not from one single event, but from a series of moments that slowly erode her sense of belonging, leaving her present but disconnected, part of the family in name but not in feeling, and through it all, Robyn maintains a narrative of unity, of love, of trying to hold everything together, her intentions presented as pure, her role as supportive, but even in these earlier moments, there are glimpses of tension, of discomfort, of something unspoken that flickers in her expressions when certain topics arise, and then we return to the present, back to the courtroom, where all of these memories now feel like pieces of a much larger story that is finally being told out loud, and the judge's voice cuts through the silence as the case is formally introduced. The legal language simple but heavy with implication. And Christine's name is called. Not just as a participant, but as the one who has brought this entire situation into the light, and there's a subtle shift in the room. A collective awareness that whatever is about to be revealed will change everything, and as documents are shuffled and prepared, Kody leans slightly forward, his jaw tightening, Robyn's grip on her hands tightening even more, Janelle's eyes narrowing just slightly, and Mary's gaze lowering as if bracing herself for something she already suspects, and the narration slows, drawing out the moment, emphasizing the weight of what's about to happen, because this isn't just about accusations or defenses. This is about truth, about years of unspoken tension finally finding a voice, and just as the first document is about to be read aloud, just as the words that could redefine everything are about to enter the room, the scene cuts sharply, leaving a silence. That feels louder than any argument, hanging on the question that now echoes through every corner of the courtroom and every mind watching it unfold. What exactly has Christine brought forward, and why now, after everything they've been through together, has she decided that this is the moment to finally break everything apart? Christine rises slowly when her name is called, and for a brief moment the entire courtroom seems to hold its breath, as if even the air itself understands that whatever she is about to say will not just be testimony, but a turning point, and she walks toward the stand with measured steps. Not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, like someone who has replayed this moment in her mind countless times and has already decided there is no going back. And when she sits, adjusting slightly before looking up, her eyes don't immediately find Kody. They scan the room first, grounding herself, before finally settling forward with a calm that feels almost unsettling given the weight of what's about to unfold. And when she begins to speak, her voice is softer than expected, steady but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper, something restrained for years. And she doesn't start with accusations. She starts with history, with context, with the life they built together, describing the early days in a way that almost feels nostalgic, reminding everyone, including Kody, of the promises that were made, the agreements they believed in, the idea that everything, love, time, resources, would be shared equally. And for a moment, it almost sounds like she's defending the family rather than challenging it. But then there's a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, as her words begin to carry a different weight, and she talks about the first time she felt something wasn't right, not a dramatic moment, not a confrontation, just a quiet realization, a small inconsistency that didn't quite make sense, and she explains how she dismissed it at first, telling herself there must be a reasonable explanation. Because that's what you do when you trust someone. You give them the benefit of the doubt, you fill in the gaps with belief instead of suspicion, and as she continues, the courtroom remains silent. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full, heavy with attention. And Kody shifts slightly in his seat, his expression tightening while Robyn keeps her gaze down, her breathing visibly uneven, and Christine's voice grows firmer, not louder but more certain, as she describes how those small inconsistencies began to form a pattern, how moments that once felt isolated started connecting in ways she couldn't ignore anymore. And then she pauses. Just. Briefly, enough to let the weight of her next words settle before she says them, and when she does, it lands like something solid hitting the center of the room. She states that she believes the family's shared finances were not handled equally, that funds intended for everyone were redirected in ways that favored certain decisions and certain households, and there's an immediate ripple through the courtroom, a shift in posture, in attention, in energy, and the defense reacts quickly, objecting to the phrasing, to the implication, but the judge allows her to continue, and Christine doesn't. Rush, she doesn't become emotional in the way people might expect. Instead, she remains composed, explaining not just what she believes, but how she came to that belief, describing specific instances where decisions were made without her knowledge, where financial choices were presented as final rather than discussed, and she emphasizes that it wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about transparency, about the understanding that they were all supposed to be equal participants in the life they built together. And as she speaks, her eyes finally move toward Kody, not with anger, not with hostility, but with a kind of clarity that feels more powerful than either, as if she's no longer seeking answers, but stating conclusions she has already reached. And Kody's reaction is subtle, but telling. His jaw tightens further, his eyes narrowing slightly, and he leans toward his attorney, whispering something under his breath, while Robyn shakes her head almost instinctively, her lips parting as if she wants to say something but can't find the words, and the prosecution begins to guide Christine deeper into her testimony, asking her to elaborate, to provide examples, and she does. Carefully, methodically, referencing moments where financial decisions were communicated after the fact, where questions were met with vague explanations, where she felt increasingly excluded from conversations that directly impacted her life, and as she continues, the narrative begins to shift. From isolated concern to systemic pattern, from personal feeling to something that carries broader implications, and Janelle's reaction becomes more noticeable now. Her posture changing slightly, her eyes lowering as certain details resonate in a way that suggests familiarity, and Mary remains still, but there's a subtle tension in her expression, a tightening around her eyes that hints at recognition, and the courtroom atmosphere grows heavier with each passing moment, as if the truth being uncovered is not entirely new to everyone present, but hearing it spoken aloud changes its weight, its reality, and Christine pauses again, this time longer, taking a breath that seems to carry years of unspoken thoughts, and when she continues, her voice softens slightly, not in weakness but in reflection, as she explains that she didn't come to this conclusion quickly, that she spent years trying to understand, trying to trust, trying to maintain the belief that everything was being handled fairly. Because acknowledging otherwise would mean accepting that something fundamental in their relationship was broken, and she admits that for a long time she chose to believe the explanations, even when they didn't fully satisfy her, because the alternative felt too overwhelming, too final, and as she says this, there's a moment where the emotional weight becomes more visible, not through tears, but through the slight change in her tone, the way her voice catches just enough to reveal what she's holding back, and then the questioning shifts slightly, focusing on when she realized she could no longer ignore it, and she describes a specific moment, not in dramatic detail, but with enough clarity to make its impact understood, a moment where the pattern became undeniable, where the explanations no longer aligned with what she was seeing, and that moment, she explains, is when everything changed for her, when trust gave way to doubt, and doubt solidified into certainty, and as she finishes this part of her testimony, the room feels different, heavier, more charged, because this is no longer just an emotional account, it's an assertion of something concrete, something that can be examined, challenged, proven, or disproven, and the defense begins their response, attempting to reframe her statements as misunderstandings, as differences in perception rather than deliberate actions, suggesting that complex family dynamics can often lead to misinterpretations, but even as they speak, the earlier impact of Christine's words lingers, and she listens without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if she has already anticipated every argument they might present, and when she is asked if she stands by her claims, she answers without hesitation. A simple affirmation that carries more weight than any elaborate explanation, and as she steps down from the stand, there is a brief moment where her gaze meets Janelle's, a silent exchange that suggests more is yet to come, more that hasn't been said, and as she returns to her seat, the courtroom remains suspended in that tension, that uncertainty, that growing realization that this case is not going to be simple, not going to be resolved with easy answers, and as the judge calls for the next phase of proceedings, the question that now hangs over everything feels unavoidable. If what Christine is saying is true, then this isn't just a misunderstanding. It's something much deeper, something that has been carefully hidden or carefully ignored, and the real question is not just whether the claims can be proven, but how far they actually go. Janelle's name is called, and for a brief second she doesn't move, as if the weight of the moment has settled over her shoulders all at once, and when she finally rises, it's slower than expected, measured, almost reluctant. Not because she isn't ready, but because she understands exactly what. Stepping onto that stand means not just legally, but emotionally, and as she walks forward, her gaze stays fixed ahead, avoiding everyone else in the room, especially Kody, because looking at him now might unravel the control she has worked so hard to maintain, and when she takes her seat and is sworn in, there's a noticeable shift in the atmosphere, because unlike Christine, who came in with a quiet certainty, Janelle carries something more complex, something layered with hesitation, conflict, and the remnants of trust that haven't fully disappeared, and when she begins to speak, her voice reflects that, calm but cautious, like someone choosing each word carefully, aware that every sentence matters, and she starts not with accusations, but with acknowledgement, acknowledging the years they spent building a life together, the structure they created, the roles they each played. And she makes it clear that for a long time, she believed in that structure completely, especially when it came to finances. She trusted Kody to manage things, to make decisions that were in the best interest of everyone, and she emphasizes that trust wasn't blind, it was built over time. Reinforced by consistency, by the belief that they were all working toward the same goals, and as she speaks, Kody shifts in his seat, his expression tightening slightly, because this isn't an attack yet, but it's laying the foundation for one, and Robyn watches closely now, her earlier emotional display replaced by a more focused attention, as if she's trying to anticipate where this is going, and Janelle continues, explaining that for years she didn't question the system, not because she didn't notice things, but because she believed there were reasonable explanations. And when something didn't make sense, she would tell herself there must be factors she wasn't aware of, details she didn't have access to, and that belief allowed her to maintain her trust even when small doubts began to surface. And she pauses briefly, her hands clasped together in front of her, and when she resumes, there's a slight shift in her tone, still controlled, but with an undercurrent of something heavier, something closer to disappointment than anger, and she describes the first time she seriously questioned the financial decisions being made, not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet moment of realization, when she was reviewing information on her own and noticed discrepancies that didn't align with what she had been told, and she explains how she didn't jump to conclusions immediately, how she spent time going over the details again and again, trying to find a logical explanation that would make everything fit, but the more she looked, the harder it became to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been told, and as she speaks, the courtroom remains completely silent. the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive because everyone understands that. This isn't just about numbers, it's about trust being questioned, and she continues, describing how those initial doubts led her to pay closer attention, to start noticing patterns she hadn't seen before, decisions that seemed to benefit certain situations more than others, conversations that happened without her involvement, outcomes that were presented as final rather than discussed, and she makes it clear that this wasn't about one isolated incident, it was about a series of moments that over time created a pattern she could no longer ignore, and Kody's reaction becomes more visible now, his posture stiffening, his jaw set tighter, as if he's holding back the urge to respond, while Robyn's expression begins to shift again, her earlier composure slipping as uncertainty creeps in, and Janelle pauses again, taking a breath that feels heavier than the last, and when she continues, her voice softens slightly, not in weakness but in reflection, as she explains that even after recognizing the pattern, she didn't confront it immediately, because confronting it would mean challenging the trust she had built over years, and that wasn't something she was ready to do lightly, and she admits that she struggled internally, questioning herself as much as the situation, wondering if she was misinterpreting things, if she was missing something, if there was still an explanation she hadn't considered, and that internal conflict becomes evident in the way she speaks. In the slight hesitation before certain words, in the way her gaze drops briefly before lifting again, and then she describes the moment she finally decided to address it directly. A private conversation with Kody, one that she approached carefully, not as an accusation, but as a question. An attempt to understand, to clarify, to resolve the doubts that had been building, and as she recounts that moment, the tension in the room sharpens. Because this is where everything begins to shift, and she explains that she expected reassurance, expected a conversation, expected some level of transparency that would restore her confidence, but instead what she received was something entirely different. A response that felt dismissive, not outright confrontational, but lacking the openness she had hoped for, and she chooses her words carefully here, not exaggerating, not dramatizing, but making it clear that the response she received did not address her concerns in a way that felt honest or complete, and that moment, she explains, is when something changed for her, when the trust she had relied on began to fracture in a way that couldn't be easily repaired. And as she says, there's a visible shift in her expression, a subtle tightening that reveals the emotional weight behind her words. And Christine watches her closely, her own expression steady but supportive, while Mary's gaze lowers again, as if this confirmation aligns with something she has long felt but never fully expressed. And the questioning continues, guiding Janelle to elaborate on how things progressed after that conversation, and she explains that instead of clarity, there was distance. Instead of resolution, there was avoidance, and that only reinforced the doubts she had been trying to resolve. And she emphasizes that this wasn't about seeking control, it was about seeking understanding, about wanting to be part of decisions that affected her life, and as she speaks, her voice grows slightly stronger, not louder, but more certain, as if saying these things out loud is solidifying what she already knows, and the defense begins to respond, attempting to frame her experience as a misunderstanding, suggesting that complex family dynamics can lead to miscommunication, but Janelle remains composed, listening without interruption, her expression unchanged, and when she is given the opportunity to respond, she does so simply, reaffirming that her concerns were not based on a single moment or a single misunderstanding, but on a pattern of experiences that, taken together, led her to the conclusions she now stands by. And as she finishes her testimony, there's a moment of stillness that feels almost heavier than any reaction, because what she has provided is not just support for Christine's claims, but an independent account that reinforces the idea that this situation is not isolated, not subjective, but shared. And as she steps down from the stand, her movements are steady, but there's a subtle release in her posture, as if something she has been carrying for a long time has finally been set down, and as she returns to her seat, she doesn't look at Kody, she doesn't look at Robyn, she keeps her gaze forward, focused, and the courtroom remains suspended in that tension, that growing realization that the narrative is shifting in a way that cannot be easily reversed, and as the judge prepares to move forward, the question that now lingers feels sharper, more urgent than before, because if both Christine and Janelle have reached similar conclusions through their own experiences, then this is no longer a matter of perspective, it's something deeper, something systemic, and the silence that follows carries that question with it, pressing against every person in the room. If this has been happening for years, why did it take so long for anyone to finally say it out loud? Robyn's name is called, and the shift in the room is immediate, almost electric, because everyone senses that this testimony will not just respond to what has been said, but potentially redefine it, and for a moment she doesn't move, her hands still tightly clasped in her lap, her shoulders slightly hunched as if the weight of every eye in the courtroom has already settled on her before she even stands. And when she finally rises, it's with a visible effort, like she's pushing herself forward through something heavy and unseen, and as she walks toward the stand, her breathing is uneven, her eyes glistening, but there's also something else there, something more complex than simple fear or sadness, something that feels like a mix of urgency and desperation, as if she knows this is her moment to be understood, to be heard, and maybe even to protect something that is already slipping away. And when she sits down and is sworn in, she takes a second longer than expected before speaking, her lips parting slightly before closing again, gathering herself, and when her voice finally comes out, it trembles, not dramatically, but enough to make it clear that she is not as composed as Christine or as controlled as Janelle, and she begins not with denial, but with a plea, a quiet insistence that she has always tried to do what was best for the family, that her intentions were never to create division or inequality, and as she speaks, her eyes briefly flick toward Kody, seeking something, support, reassurance, confirmation, but his expression remains tight, guarded, and she quickly looks away, focusing forward again as she continues, explaining that from her perspective, the family has always been complex, that decisions were never as simple as they might appear from the outside, and that there were always factors, pressures, and responsibilities that influenced how things were handled, and the prosecution listens carefully, allowing her to establish her narrative before beginning their questioning, and when they do, the tone shifts slightly, becoming more precise, more focused, asking her to clarify her role in the financial decisions that have been brought into question, and Robyn responds carefully, emphasizing that she was not in control, that she did not make the final decisions, that she trusted Kody to manage those aspects just as the others did, and for a moment it seems like she is aligning her position with Janelle's earlier testimony, presenting herself as another person who relied on Kody's leadership, but then the questioning narrows, focusing on specific instances, specific timelines, asking her to explain certain decisions, certain outcomes, and as the details become more specific, small inconsistencies begin to emerge. Not blatant contradictions, but subtle misalignments between her statements and the information already presented. And each one is small on its own, easy to overlook, but together they begin to create a sense of uncertainty, and Robyn's composure starts to slip slightly, her answers becoming less fluid, her pauses a little longer, as if she's searching not just for the right words, but for the right version of events to present, and the tension in the room builds steadily. Because this is no longer just about emotion, it's about credibility, and Christine watches intently, her expression unchanged but her focus unwavering, while Janelle's gaze lowers again, not out of disinterest but out of a quiet recognition of what is unfolding, and Miri shifts slightly in her seat, her posture straightening just enough to signal that she is paying closer attention now, and Robyn continues to insist that she never asked for preferential treatment, that she never intended to benefit at the expense of anyone else, and her voice rises slightly here, not in anger, but in urgency, as if she needs the court to believe not just what she is saying, but what she feels, and the prosecution responds by asking her about her awareness, about what she knew and when she knew it, and this is where the shift becomes more pronounced, because her earlier certainty gives way to hesitation, her answers becoming more cautious, more qualified, and she begins to distance herself from the specifics, emphasizing that she was not involved in every detail, that she did not have full visibility into every decision, and then, almost unexpectedly, she says it, quietly but clearly, that she didn't know everything, and the impact of that statement is immediate, the courtroom falling into a deeper silence than before. Because this changes the narrative in a significant way, it introduces the possibility that even within the structure that has been described, there were layers of information, levels of awareness that were not shared equally, and for a brief moment, Robyn seems to realize the weight of what she has just said, her eyes widening slightly before she looks down again, her hands tightening once more, and the prosecution seizes on this, asking her to clarify, to explain what she means by not knowing everything, and she struggles slightly here, trying to articulate a position that maintains her earlier statements while also acknowledging this new admission, explaining that she trusted Kody, that she believed he was handling things appropriately, that she did not question certain decisions because she assumed they were being made with full consideration of the family's needs, and as she speaks, her voice wavers again, the emotional strain becoming more visible, and Kody's reaction becomes harder to ignore, his posture shifting, his expression tightening further, a flicker of something, frustration, maybe even concern, crossing his face as the focus begins to move toward him more directly, and the defense attempts to redirect, to bring the narrative back to intention, to emphasize that complexity and miscommunication can lead to misunderstandings without implying wrongdoing, but the earlier momentum has already shifted, and the idea that Robyn may not have been fully aware of everything opens a new line of questioning, a new perspective that wasn't as prominent before, and Christine's gaze shifts slightly now. Not toward Robyn, but toward Kody, as if this is the direction she expected things to move all along, and Janelle remains still, but there's a subtle change in her expression, a quiet confirmation of something she has been considering, and Robyn is asked one more time about her role, about her knowledge, about her understanding of the decisions that have been called into question, and this time her answer is softer, less certain, acknowledging that there were things she may not have fully understood, decisions she did not fully question at the time, and that admission, while not dramatic, carries significant weight, because it reinforces the idea that the system itself may have been more controlled, more centralized than it was presented, and as her testimony begins to wind down, the emotional toll is evident, her earlier urgency giving way to exhaustion, her voice quieter, her posture more withdrawn, and when she steps down from the stand, she moves quickly, almost as if she wants to escape the intensity of the moment, returning to her seat without looking at anyone directly, and the courtroom remains suspended in that tension, that shifting dynamic where the focus has subtly, but unmistakably moved. Because this is no longer just about what Christine and Janelle experienced, it's about how those experiences fit into a larger structure, one that may not have been as transparent or as shared as it appeared, and as the judge calls for order and prepares to move forward. The question that now lingers feels sharper, more pointed than before, because if Robyn truly didn't know everything, then who did? And more importantly, who was making sure that certain things remained unknown? The courtroom feels different now, heavier, like every word spoken so far has been leading to something that hasn't quite revealed itself yet, and as the judge signals for the next phase to begin, there's a subtle shift in posture across the room, a collective anticipation that something more Concrete, something less open to interpretation, is about to enter the narrative, and the prosecution rises slowly, deliberately, holding a single folder that at first glance seems unremarkable, but the way it's handled, the careful, almost measured pace at which it's brought forward, gives it a weight that is immediately felt by everyone watching, and Christine's expression remains steady, unchanged, but there's a quiet certainty in her eyes now, as if she has been waiting for this exact moment, while Janelle leans forward slightly, her earlier composure giving way to a more focused attention, and Robyn, still recovering from her testimony, watches with a mixture of confusion and unease, her hands once again clasped tightly together, and Kody's reaction is the most telling, because for the first time since the proceedings began, there's a flicker of something that looks like uncertainty crossing his face, quickly masked but not completely hidden, and the folder is placed on the table, opened carefully, and a document is removed, its presence almost understated in its simplicity. Just paper, just ink. Nothing dramatic in appearance, but as it's introduced into evidence, the energy in the room tightens, like a string being pulled just a little too far, and the prosecution begins to speak, explaining that this document provides insight into the decision-making structure that has been described throughout the testimonies and as the words are read aloud. The initial reaction is subtle, because on the surface, it doesn't sound explosive, it sounds procedural, technical, outlining roles, responsibilities, authorizations, but as the details unfold, the implications begin to take shape, and what emerges is not just a record of decisions, but a pattern of control, a structure that places authority in a way that doesn't align with the idea of shared responsibility that has been repeatedly emphasized, and Christine doesn't move, her stillness almost more powerful than any reaction, because it signals that this is not new to her, that this is something she has already processed, already accepted, while Janelle's expression shifts, her brows drawing together slightly as the information connects with the doubts she has already expressed, and Robyn's confusion deepens, her eyes moving between the document and Kody as if trying to reconcile what she's hearing with what she believed, and Kody's composure begins to crack, not dramatically, not in a way that draws immediate attention, but in small, telling ways, his posture stiffening further, his gaze fixed on the document with an intensity that suggests recognition. And the prosecution continues, highlighting specific sections, specific authorizations, moments where decisions were made unilaterally, where control was exercised in a way that contradicts the narrative of equal participation, and the defense responds quickly, attempting to contextualize the document to frame it as a necessary structure for managing complexity, arguing that leadership does not equate to exclusion, that decisions sometimes need to be centralized for efficiency, but even as they speak, the impact of the document lingers, because it doesn't just suggest leadership. It suggests a level of control that was not fully disclosed, and the questioning shifts, directing attention back to Kody, asking him to explain the document, to clarify its purpose, its scope, its implications, and for a moment there's hesitation, brief but noticeable, before he begins to respond. His voice controlled but carrying an edge that wasn't there before, explaining that the document reflects practical decisions made to manage a complex family structure, that it was never intended to exclude or disadvantage anyone, but rather to ensure stability and consistency. And as he speaks, the prosecution listens carefully, allowing him to establish his explanation before introducing a critical detail, a timeline that places certain decisions in a context that raises further questions, suggesting that the level of control outlined in the document may have extended beyond what was necessary, beyond what was communicated, and this is where the tension sharpens, because the narrative is no longer just about perception or experience, it's about documented reality, about something that exists independently of interpretation, and Christine finally moves slightly, not dramatically, just enough to shift her posture, a small but significant change that draws attention to her presence, and Janelle's gaze lifts, her earlier uncertainty now replaced by a more defined understanding, while Robyn looks increasingly unsettled, her earlier statement about not knowing. Everything echoing in the context of what is now being revealed, and Kody's responses become more defensive, more precise, as he attempts to maintain control of the narrative, emphasizing intention, context, necessity, but the document remains, its presence undeniable, its implications difficult to fully neutralize, and the prosecution presses further, asking about specific decisions, specific outcomes that align with the structure outlined in the document, and with each question, the gap between the presented narrative and the documented reality becomes more apparent, not in a single dramatic reveal, but in a series of connections that build upon each other, creating a picture that is harder to dismiss with each passing moment. And the courtroom reacts subtly, a shift in attention, in posture, in the unspoken understanding that something significant is unfolding. And Mary, who has remained mostly still until now, closes her eyes briefly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that suggests a deeper emotional response, as if this confirmation aligns with something she has long felt but never fully articulated, and as the questioning continues, the focus expands, not just on the document itself, but on its implications, on what it means for the relationships, for the trust that has been described, and the narrative that once centered on shared responsibility begins to unravel, replaced by a more complex, more controlled structure that challenges the foundation of. Everything that has been said, and Kody's composure continues to strain under the pressure, his earlier confidence giving way to a more reactive stance, while Robyn's uncertainty deepens into something closer to realization, her gaze no longer searching for answers, but absorbing the weight of what is being revealed, and Christine remains steady, her earlier calm now carrying a sense of validation, not satisfaction, but confirmation. And Janelle's expression reflects a similar shift, her earlier doubts now solidified into something more certain. And as the document is fully presented and entered into the record, the room feels different again, not just tense, but transformed. Because this is no longer a question of whether something was wrong, it's a question of how deep it goes. And as the judge calls for a brief pause, the silence that follows is heavy with implication. Every person in the room processing what has just been revealed, and the narration slows, drawing out the moment, emphasizing the shift that has taken place. Because this document is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new phase, one where the focus moves beyond individual experiences too. The structure that shaped them, and as the scene lingers on the faces in the room, on the subtle reactions that speak louder than words, one question rises above all others, sharper, clearer, more unavoidable than anything that has come before. If this level of control existed all along, then how? Much of the truth has still not been uncovered.